"We're restructuring," Derek said, not even looking up from his phone. "Your role has been eliminated." He said it like he was ordering lunch. Casual. Distracted. Already thinking about his next meeting. I sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room on the 32nd floor of Hartwell Capital Management, watching this 31-year-old in his custom suit and $200 haircut tell me that my 19 years of keeping this firm solvent meant nothing. The Chicago skyline stretched behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows. Lake Michigan glittered in the afternoon sun. Inside, the air smelled like leather chairs and old money. Derek finally glanced up, flashing that smile that came standard with his MBA. "Nothing personal, Margaret, just business." Nothing personal, just business. The corporate mantra of people who've never built anything themselves. I sat there with my hands folded on the table, didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me crack. After 19 years in compliance, you learn that desperation is just poor documentation, and I had documented everything. What Derek didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that my signature was the only thing standing between this firm and federal regulators. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Margaret Sullivan. Everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 54 years old, and for the last 19 years, I've been the Chief Compliance Officer at Hartwell Capital Management. That title sounds impressive. It's not. What I actually am is the woman who reads the fine print that nobody else wants to read, the one who stays until midnight reviewing transaction logs when the auditors are coming, the one who explains to traders why they can't just do whatever they want with other people's money. I'm the human firewall between this firm and the SEC. Hartwell manages about $12 billion in assets, pension funds, university endowments, family trusts, the retirement savings of teachers and firefighters and nurses who are counting on us to not screw it up. If we make a mistake, real people lose real money, people who can't afford to lose it. No pressure. The finance industry runs on trust. Clients trust us with their money, regulators trust us to follow the rules, and the whole system trusts that someone, somewhere, is actually paying attention. That someone was me. See, running a financial firm isn't just about making money. It's about proving you're allowed to make money. Registrations, licenses, compliance filings, regulatory examinations. The paperwork is endless, and every single piece of it needs to be perfect. Most people's eyes glaze over at the word compliance. Mine light up, because I understand something that the traders and the portfolio managers and the corner office executives never seem to grasp. The regulations aren't obstacles, they're weapons. You can have the smartest traders in the world, you can have algorithms that predict market movements before they happen, you can have client relationships going back generations, but without the right signatures on the right forms, you're just a very expensive group of people who aren't legally allowed to touch anyone's money. I've spent 19 years collecting those signatures, building relationships with regulators, understanding the rules down to the footnotes. And here's the thing that Derek and his Harvard MBA didn't bother to learn. Certain critical filings require a designated compliance officer, not just any compliance officer, a specific person named in the registration documents who has passed specific examinations and maintains specific certifications. The firm's entire ability to operate as a registered investment advisor depends on having that person on staff. 3 guesses whose name was on those documents. The office smelled like fresh coffee and printer toner when I walked through it that last morning. I'd arrived at 6 a.m. like I always did, reviewed the overnight trading logs, checked the compliance calendar for upcoming deadlines, made sure nothing had fallen through the cracks. The traders wouldn't arrive until 8, the partners wouldn't stroll in until 9, but I was already there, doing the invisible work that kept everything running. Let me tell you how I got here, because you need to understand what Derek was really destroying. 19 years ago, Hartwell Capital was a three-person operation: Richard Hartwell, a secretary named Donna, and me. I'd just left a job at the SEC, 5 years as an examiner, crawling through the books of investment advisors looking for fraud and incompetence. The pay was government grade, which meant barely enough to live on in Chicago. Richard was starting fresh after leaving a big Wall Street firm. He had the connections and the investment philosophy. What he didn't have was someone who understood compliance. He found me through a mutual friend, offered me twice what the government was paying. More importantly, he offered me a chance to build something. "I don't want to spend my time fighting regulators," Richard told me in our first meeting. "I want to spend it managing money. I need someone who can keep the SEC happy so I can focus on clients." That someone was me. The first year was chaos. I wrote every policy, filed every form, built the compliance program from scratch, using knowledge I'd gained from the other side of the regulatory fence. When the SEC came for our first examination, they found nothing, not a single deficiency. The lead examiner told me it was the cleanest shop he'd seen in 15 years. Richard gave me a bonus that year, said I was worth every penny and more. The firm grew: 5 employees, then 20, then 50. We added a second office in Milwaukee, then a third in Minneapolis. And through all of it, I was the constant, the person who made sure we could keep operating, the person who maintained the relationships with the regulators, the person who knew where every body was buried and every form was filed. Richard understood my value. He promoted me to Chief Compliance Officer, gave me a seat at the management table, included me in strategic decisions. Then he had his heart attack. I visited him in the hospital. He looked small in that bed, fragile, nothing like the confident man who'd built a $12 billion firm. "I'm stepping back," he told me. "Derek's taking over." I tried to hide my concern. Richard saw it anyway. "Give him a chance, Maggie. He's my son. He'll learn." I wanted to believe him. I really did. Derek didn't learn. Derek dismantled. But I was still holding everything together. Still the name on the filings. Still the designated compliance officer. Still irreplaceable, even if Garrick didn't know it. I loved this place. I'd built its compliance program from scratch when it was just a 3-person shop operating out of a converted apartment, and they were throwing me out like yesterday's Wall Street Journal. But before I tell you how I watched their entire operation collapse, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, drop a like. The algorithm feeds on engagement, and frankly, I'm going to need witnesses for what comes next. Done? Good. Let's get back to Derek. Derek Hartwell wasn't earned, he was inherited. His father, Richard Hartwell, founded the firm 35 years ago, built it from nothing into one of the most respected boutique investment managers in the Midwest. Old school, handshake deals, personal relationships with every client. Richard came from nothing, grew up in a 3-room apartment on the South Side, put himself through school, worked his way up from mailroom clerk to portfolio manager to founder. He understood work. He understood earning things. Derek understood neither. Richard had a heart attack 3 years ago, survived but decided to step back, handed the reins to his only son. Derek had spent exactly 4 years at the firm before becoming CEO. Most of that time was spent learning the business, which apparently meant taking long lunches and attending conferences in warm places. He floated in on a cloud of entitlement and hair product, suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage, a watch collection that could fund a small college scholarship, the kind of confidence that only comes from never having earned anything. I remember his first day as CEO. He walked through the office like he was touring a property he'd just purchased, which, in a way, he had. He stopped at my desk, looked at the stacks of regulatory filings, the compliance manuals, the examination schedules. "What is all this?" he asked. "Our compliance program," I said. "The regulations we follow, the filings we submit, the framework that keeps us operating legally." He nodded, clearly not listening. "Streamline it," he said, and walked away. Streamline it. Like 19 years of regulatory requirements could be summarized in a PowerPoint. His official title was Chief Executive Officer. What he actually did was attend board meetings, interrupt people who knew what they were talking about, and make decisions based on whatever he'd read in the Financial Times that morning. First month, he fired the head of trading because he didn't like his energy. The head of trading was named Robert Chen, 22 years with the firm. He'd generated $42 million in profits the previous year. His replacement, a 30-year-old from a hedge fund, generated a $12 million loss in the first quarter. Derek blamed market conditions and moved on. Second month, he brought in a consulting firm to optimize operations. McKinsey, $800,000 for a 3-month engagement. The consultants produced a 200-page report. The executive summary recommended firing the administrative staff, 7 people, combined experience of 93 years. We lost 3 decades of institutional knowledge so Derek could save money on salaries. Third month, he decided the compliance department was bloated. We had 4 people managing compliance for a $12 billion firm. The industry standard was twice that. Derek didn't care about industry standards. He cared about the bottom line on his quarterly reports. He cared about impressing the board. He cared about looking like a decisive leader. He didn't care about understanding what he was deciding. I tried to warn him once. "Derek," I said in my most diplomatic voice, "compliance isn't optional. The regulations are getting stricter, not looser. We need more resources, not fewer." He looked at me like I'd suggested he take a pay cut. "Margaret," he said, using my full name like it was an insult, "I've consulted with some of the top minds in finance. They all agree that compliance is a cost center, not a profit center. We need to be lean." Lean, the favorite word of people who don't understand what they're cutting. But I was the biggest line item in his cost center spreadsheet. 19 years of experience meant 19 years of salary increases, benefits, retirement contributions. On paper, I was expensive. On paper, I was redundant. What the paper didn't show was that my name was the only thing standing between this firm and regulatory shutdown. The meeting was scheduled at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. I knew what was coming. You don't spend 19 years reading people and regulations without developing a sixth sense of danger. The whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by. The HR emails that CC'd people they shouldn't have. Derek's assistant scheduling a strategic discussion when no strategic discussion was due. I dressed carefully that morning. My best blazer, comfortable heels, nothing that would look disheveled when they walked me out. I also made copies of certain documents, not client information, nothing proprietary, just my own records, my examination certificates, my registration numbers, things I might need for my next position, whatever that turned out to be. The meeting was scheduled at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. I knew what was coming. You don't spend 19 years reading people and regulations without developing a sixth sense of danger. The whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by. The HR emails that CC'd people they shouldn't have. Derek's assistant scheduling a strategic discussion when no strategic discussion was due. I dressed carefully that morning. My best blazer, comfortable heels, nothing that would look disheveled when they walked me out. I also made copies of certain documents, not client information, nothing proprietary, just my own records, my examination certificates, my registration numbers, things I might need for my next position, whatever that turned out to be. The meeting was scheduled at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. I knew what was coming. You don't spend 19 years reading people and regulations without developing a sixth sense of danger. The whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by. The HR emails that CC'd people they shouldn't have. Derek's assistant scheduling a strategic discussion when no strategic discussion was due. I dressed carefully that morning. My best blazer, comfortable heels, nothing that would look disheveled when they walked me out. I also made copies of certain documents, not client information, nothing proprietary, just my own records, my examination certificates, my registration numbers, things I might need for my next position, whatever that turned out to be. The meeting was scheduled at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. I knew what was coming. You don't spend 19 years reading people and regulations without developing a sixth sense of danger. The whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by.
the HR emails that CC'd people they shouldn't have, Derek's assistant scheduling a strategic discussion when no strategic discussion was due. I dressed carefully that morning. My desk blazer, comfortable heels, nothing that would look disheveled when they walked me out. I also made copies of certain documents, not client information, nothing proprietary, just my own records, my examination certificates, my registration numbers, things I might need for my next position, whatever that turned out to be. The meeting was scheduled at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. I knew what was coming. You don't spend 19 years reading people and regulations without developing a sixth sense of danger. The whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by, the HR emails that CC'd people they shouldn't have, Derek's assistant scheduling a strategic discussion when no strategic discussion was due. I dressed carefully that morning. My best blazer, comfortable heels, nothing that would look disheveled when they walked me out. I also made copies of certain documents, not client information, nothing proprietary, just my own records, my examination certificates, my registration numbers, things I might need for my next position, whatever that turned out to be. The meeting was scheduled at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. I knew what was coming. You don't spend 19 years reading people and regulations without developing a sixth sense of danger. The whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by, the HR emails that CC'd people they shouldn't have, Derek's assistant scheduling a strategic discussion when no strategic discussion was due. I dressed carefully that morning. My desk blazer, comfortable heels, nothing that would look disheveled when they walked me out. I also made copies of certain documents, not client information, nothing proprietary, just my own records, my examination certificates, my registration numbers, things I might need for my next position, whatever that turned out to be. The meeting was scheduled at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. I knew what was coming. You don't spend 19 years reading people and regulations without developing a sixth sense of danger. The whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by, the HR emails that CC'd people they shouldn't have, Derek's assistant scheduling a strategic discussion when no strategic discussion was due. I dressed carefully that morning. My best blazer, comfortable heels, nothing that would look disheveled when they walked me out. I also made copies of certain documents, not client information, nothing proprietary, just my own records, my examination certificates, my registration numbers, things I might need for my next position, whatever that turned out to be. The meeting was scheduled at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday. I knew what was coming. You don't spend 19 years reading people and regulations without developing a sixth sense of danger. The whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by, the HR emails that CC'd people they shouldn't have, Derek's assistant scheduling a strategic discussion when no strategic discussion was due. I dressed carefully that morning. My best blazer, comfortable heels, nothing that would look disheveled when they walked me out. I also made copies of certain documents, not client information, nothing proprietary.
Silence in the room. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they might have missed something critical. "What are you talking about?" Derek demanded. I stood up, smoothed my blazer, picked up my purse. "I'm talking about the fact that the SEC requires registered investment advisors to have a designated chief compliance officer, a specific individual named in the registration who has passed specific examinations, who maintains specific certifications." The lawyer's eyes widened. He was starting to understand. Derek wasn't. "So we'll designate someone else. It's just paperwork." The examinations take approximately 18 months to complete, longer if you factor in the study time, and the SEC doesn't look kindly on firms that operate without a properly designated CCO. "That's absurd. We can hire someone." "You can try. Qualified compliance officers are in high demand, and the ones who are available will want to know why the previous CCO was terminated. It tends to raise red flags." I walked toward the door, stopped, turned back. "Good luck with everything, Derek. I suspect you're going to need it." I walked out of that conference room with my head high and my heart pounding. Behind me, I heard Derek's voice, already dismissive. What was that about? Some kind of threat? The HR woman murmured something about emotional responses.
The lawyer was pulling out his phone, starting to Google something, starting to realize they had no idea. Not yet, but they would. The thing about compliance documentation is that nobody reads it until they have to. For 19 years, every Form ADV, every annual filing, every regulatory submission had my name on it. Not because I was the only one who could sign them, but because I was the only one who understood them. The designations weren't tied to the company, they were tied to me. When Derek took over from his father, the lawyers had done due diligence on the financial stuff, assets under management, fee structures, client contracts. What they hadn't done was audit the regulatory structure. They assumed everything would continue automatically. They assumed wrong. The SEC requires registered investment advisors to maintain a designated chief compliance officer at all times, not when convenient, not when we get around to it, at all times. That CCO must have passed the Series 65 examination, must maintain continuing education requirements, must be named specifically in the firm's regulatory filings. It takes about 18 months to get fully qualified, longer if you don't pass the exams on the first try, and the failure rate is higher than most people think. I had been that designated CCO for 19 years. Every filing, every examination, every regulatory relationship. All of it walked out the door with me, which meant that as of 2:47 p.m. on that Wednesday, Hartwell Capital Management was operating a $12 billion investment advisory firm without a properly designated CCO. The SEC tends to notice things like that. I drove home slowly, took the long way through Lincoln Park, stopped for coffee at my favorite spot near the lake. The barista knew my order by heart. Medium dark roast, splash of cream, no sugar. I sat at my usual table by the window and watched the joggers pass by on the lakefront trail. My phone buzzed, my son checking in. I texted back that everything was fine, I'd call him later. Everything was fine, it really was, because I knew exactly what was about to happen. By the next morning, the panic had begun. I was making breakfast when my phone started lighting up. Former colleagues, industry contacts, old friends from my days at the regulatory agencies. The word was spreading. Fast. Derek had apparently spent the previous evening figuring out what I'd meant about the Form ADV. He'd called the firm's outside counsel at 11 p.m. The outside counsel called the SEC hotline at 6 a.m. The news wasn't good. Hartwell was technically in violation of Section 206-47 of the Investment Advisors Act, operating without a properly designated CCO. The SEC had the authority to suspend their registration pending remediation. Suspension for a $12 billion firm. That would mean frozen assets, panicked clients, headlines in the financial press. Derek called me at 8:14 a.m. I let it go to voicemail. His message was terse. "Margaret, this is Derek. We need to discuss some transition matters. Call me immediately." He called again at 8:31 and 8:52 and 9:17. At 9:30, he started texting, "Maggie, we need to talk. This is urgent. Please respond. There appears to be some confusion about regulatory requirements." Confusion? That was cute. I made myself another coffee and watched the notifications pile up. By noon, the calls were coming from Richard Hartwell himself, the founder, the man who'd hired me 19 years ago, the man who'd handed his life's work to a son who didn't understand it. "Maggie," he said when I finally answered. His voice was tired, worried, the voice of a man watching his legacy crumble. "Richard, I'm sorry it's come to this. Derek didn't understand. He didn't realize. No, he didn't. And he didn't ask." Silence on the line. I could hear Richard breathing, could picture him sitting in his study surrounded by the awards and photographs of a lifetime in finance. "What would it take to fix this?" he asked quietly. "Honestly, at this point, you need a qualified CCO on staff within 30 days, or the SEC will start formal proceedings. The problem is finding someone qualified who's willing to walk into this situation." "Would you consider—" "No, Richard, I wouldn't." More silence. "I understand," he said finally. "I'm sorry, Maggie, for everything." "So am I." I hung up and took another sip of my coffee. The dominoes had started to fall. Day 2 was when things got interesting. The SEC sent a formal inquiry letter, not a subpoena, not yet, just a request for information about the firm's compliance structure following the departure of its designated CCO. In regulatory terms, that's like a shot across the bow. They're letting you know they're watching. They're letting you know they can make things very uncomfortable if they don't like what they see. I knew how these things worked. I'd been on the other side. 5 years as an SEC examiner, remember? The inquiry letter would have arrived at Hartwell's registered address at approximately 10 a.m. Certified mail, return receipt requested. Someone in the mailroom would have opened it, seen the SEC letterhead, and immediately forwarded it to legal. Legal would have read it, started sweating, and called Derek. Derek would have read it, not understood it, and called his father. Richard would have read it, understood it completely, and felt his heart skip a beat. That's how these things go. The dominoes fall in a very predictable pattern. Derek apparently panicked, called an emergency board meeting, brought in 3 different law firms to assess the situation. The assessment wasn't pretty. I know because one of the lawyers was a former colleague of mine. She called me that evening, speaking in careful hypotheticals that weren't hypothetical at all. If someone were advising a firm in this situation, she said, they would tell them they have approximately 30 days to remedy the deficiency before the SEC escalates to formal proceedings. That sounds like a tight timeline. It is, especially if the firm has been difficult to work with in the past. Difficult to work with, that was one way of putting it. Derek had refused 2 SEC information requests during his tenure as CEO, said they were fishing expeditions, said the firm had nothing to hide. The SEC doesn't forget things like that. They keep notes, they hold grudges, and when an opportunity comes to make an example of someone who's been uncooperative, they take it. Option 1, find a qualified CCO immediately. Problem: qualified CCOs don't grow on trees. The good ones are employed. The available ones often have reasons for being available. Option 2, outsource compliance to a consulting firm. Problem: the SEC requires an internal designated CCO. Consultants can supplement, but they can't replace. Option 3, fast-track someone through the examinations. Problem: the Series 65 exam has a 70% pass rate, and even if someone passed tomorrow, they wouldn't have the experience or relationships to navigate the current situation. Option 4, negotiate with me. Derek chose option 4, reluctantly. The call came at 4 p.m. on day 2. Margaret. Derek's voice was strained, controlled, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. We've reconsidered the restructuring decision. We'd like to discuss your return to the firm. I'm listening. Full reinstatement. Same salary, same benefits. We'll pretend this never happened. No. Silence. What do you mean no? I mean no, Derek. I won't be returning under those terms. What terms would you accept? I'd been thinking about this, had a number in mind, had done the math on what my replacement would cost them, what the regulatory penalties would be, what the reputational damage would total. A 2-year contract, $300,000 per year, plus a 20% retention bonus at the end, full authority over all compliance matters, no interference from you or anyone else, and a written acknowledgement from the board that my termination was a mistake. More silence. I could hear Derek grinding his teeth. That's absurd. That's market rate for crisis compliance work. Actually, it's below market. I'm offering a discount because I have some fondness for your father. This is extortion. No, Derek, this is capitalism. You eliminated my position because I was too expensive. Now you're discovering what expensive actually looks like. My lawyers will be in touch. I'm sure they will. Tell them to look up SEC release number IA5765. It's enlightening reading. I hung up. My phone rang immediately again. I turned it off. Then I made myself dinner, called my son. He's 32 now, architect in Seattle, good kid, worried about his mother. I'm fine, I told him. Better than fine, actually. Sometimes you have to lose something to realize it was holding you back. He didn't understand. He would. I watched some television, made myself tea, went to bed early. Let them sweat. The offers started escalating on day 3. First, they agreed to my salary demands. I declined. Then they added a signing bonus, $50,000. I declined. Then they offered equity, 2% of the firm's profits. I considered it for about 30 seconds, then I declined. What I didn't decline was a call from a woman named Victoria Chen. Victoria was the managing partner at Meridian Wealth Advisors, our biggest competitor. She'd been trying to recruit me for years. I'd always said no because I was loyal to Hartwell. Loyalty. What a joke. I hurry what happened, Victoria said. I'm sorry. Don't be. It's the best thing that ever happened to me. That's what I was hoping you'd say. I have a proposition. Victoria's proposition was elegant in its simplicity. Meridian was expanding. They needed a senior compliance officer to oversee their growth, someone with experience, someone with regulatory relationships, someone who could hit the ground running. We'd want you as partner, Victoria said, not employee, partner. Equity stake, voice in firm decisions, the whole package. When do you need an answer? Yesterday, but I can give you 24 hours. I took 6. The job was everything Hartwell should have been. Better title, better money, real authority, a seat at the table where decisions actually got made, and the satisfaction of watching Derek try to explain to his father, to the board, to the SEC, how he'd destroyed a 35-year-old firm by firing the wrong person. The final meeting happened on day 7. I didn't attend, didn't need to, but I heard about it from 5 different sources within an hour. Richard Hartwell had come out of retirement, driven to the office himself. His doctor had told him to avoid stress. His cardiologist had warned him about his blood pressure. He came anyway. This was his legacy, his life's work, and his son had set it on fire.
He walked into the boardroom looking like he'd aged 10 years in a week, gray-faced, moving slowly, but his eyes were sharp, angry, the eyes of a man who'd finally stopped making excuses for his son. The board was there, all 9 members. Some of them had been with the firm since the beginning. Some of them had voted to give Derek the CEO position against their better judgment. They all looked uncomfortable now. Nobody makes eye contact when the ship is sinking. The lawyers were there, 4 firms now, security specialists, corporate counsel, crisis management, employment law in case Derek decided to sue. The meter was running at about $4,000 an hour, combined. And Derek was there, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His custom suit was rumpled, the buttons were pulling, his $200 haircut was disheveled and greasy. His confidence had evaporated like morning dew. He'd tried to prepare a defense. I heard he had a PowerPoint presentation, slides about operational efficiency and strategic repositioning. Nobody wanted to see it. They'd spent a week trying to find a solution, any solution. They'd contacted every qualified CCO in Chicago. Most of them weren't interested. The firm's situation was too public, too messy, too likely to end badly. The few who showed interest asked too many questions. Why was the previous CCO terminated? What's the current status with the SEC? How bad are the books, really? One woman in New York had the right qualifications, 22 years of experience, former FINRA examiner, exactly what they needed. She wanted $400,000 a year, plus a guaranteed severance package of 2 years' salary, plus a clause allowing her to leave without penalty if she found the compliance systems inadequate. That last clause was the killer. It meant she expected to find problems. It meant she was already planning her exit. Richard's face turned gray when he heard the terms, not because of the money, because of what it implied. His firm was damaged goods. The market knew it, the regulators knew it, everyone knew it except Derek. The SEC inquiry had escalated. What started as a request for information had become a formal examination. Examiners would be on site within 2 weeks, 3 of them,
plus a specialist from the enforcement division. The enforcement division doesn't show up for routine examinations. They show up when they think something is seriously wrong. Do you know what happens when SEC examiners find compliance deficiencies at a registered investment advisor? I did. I'd seen it happen to competitors over the years. I'd helped make it happen back in my examiner days. First, there are findings, formal documentation of everything wrong, every missed deadline, every inadequate procedure, every gap in the control environment. Then there are remediation requirements, a detailed plan to fix everything, subject to SEC approval, subject to ongoing monitoring. Then there are penalties, civil fines, disgorgement of fees, sometimes referrals to the Justice Department for criminal prosecution. And throughout all of it, there's the reputational damage. Clients calling to ask questions, prospects deciding to go elsewhere, industry publications running stories about regulatory troubles at Hartwell Capital. Trust is everything in finance. Lose it once and you might never get it back. All because Derek wanted to save money by firing the expensive lady in the sensible heels. I heard that Derek tried to blame me in the meeting, tried to say I'd been insubordinate, that I'd deliberately made myself indispensable to hold the firm hostage. Richard shut him down, hard. You fired a 19-year employee without understanding what she did, Richard said. His voice was quiet, cold, the voice of a father realizing his son had destroyed everything he'd built. You didn't ask, you didn't listen, you just decided you knew better. Derek tried to argue, tried to explain. Richard wasn't having it. You're done, he said, effective immediately. I'm coming back. The board voted unanimously. Derek was removed as CEO. Richard would return as interim leader while they searched for a permanent replacement. Derek was escorted out of the building by security. Same walk I'd taken 6 days earlier. Same mahogany hallways, same oil paintings of dead men. Karma moves in circles.
The SEC examination happened 3 weeks later. I watched from my new office at Meridian. Corner suite, lake view. Victoria had set me up beautifully, even though I was still getting oriented. The examination didn't go well for Hartwell. Multiple findings, material weaknesses in the compliance program, inadequate supervision, insufficient documentation. The SEC imposed a censure, a $150,000 fine, required engagement of an independent compliance consultant for 2 years. The consultant they hired? My former colleague from the industry. She called to tell me about it. Said the systems were in worse shape than she'd expected, said it would take at least 18 months to get everything properly remediated. The clients started leaving almost immediately. Pension funds, university endowments, family trusts. Nobody wanted their money managed by a firm that couldn't keep its own house in order. They came to Meridian instead, to Victoria, to me. Within 6 months, we'd captured 35% of Hartwell's former client base, $3 billion in assets, transferred because a 31-year-old with an MBA thought he knew better than a 54-year-old with 19 years of experience. Derek tried to start his own advisory firm, applied for registration with the SEC. His application was denied. Turns out having your previous firm censured while you were CEO raises some flags. Last I heard, he's selling insurance in the suburbs. Life policies, annuities, commission-based work where nobody trusts him with actual investment decisions. Richard sold the firm 8 months after the examination, merged it with a larger competitor, took a significant loss on the valuation. The regulatory issues had made it essentially unsaleable at fair market value. He sent me a card when the deal closed, handwritten, said he was sorry for how things had ended, said I deserved better, said he hoped I was happy at Meridian. I wrote back, told him I was, told him I didn't blame him, told him his son had made decisions that Richard couldn't have prevented. I'm not sure if that's true, but it seemed like the kind thing to say. I'm sitting in my corner office at Meridian now. Lake Michigan stretches out below me, endless and blue. The morning light makes everything look possible.
The office is everything I ever wanted. Floor-to-ceiling windows, actual art on the walls instead of cheap prints, a conference table where people actually listen when I speak. Victoria made me a partner 6 months ago, full equity stake, vote on all major firm decisions, the kind of authority I never had at Hartwell. The partnership announcement went out to all our clients. Several of them called to congratulate me. Several more called to move their accounts from wherever they'd been. Turns out my reputation preceded me. 19 years of keeping a firm clean, 19 years of relationships with regulators, 19 years of being the person who makes everything works. That reputation has value, real value, the kind you can put a number on. My name is on all the regulatory filings now, every Form ADV, every annual update, every compliance certification. Not because I demanded it, because Victoria understands something Derek never did. The compliance officer isn't a cost center. The compliance officer is the foundation, the person who makes everything else possible. The reason the regulators don't shut you down and the clients trust you with their money. I have an assistant now, first time in 19 years. Her name is Jennifer. She's 26, eager, reminds me of myself at that age. I'm teaching her everything I know, the regulations, the relationships, the boring stuff that makes everyone's eyes glaze over, because someday she'll be sitting where I'm sitting, and I want to make sure she's ready. Last week, a young analyst asked me what my secret was, how I'd built a career that gave me this kind of leverage. I told her the same thing I'll tell you. Learn the boring stuff, the regulations, the filings, the examinations that make everyone's eyes glaze over. Because when everyone else is chasing the exciting deals and the big bonuses, the person who understands the boring stuff is the one who actually keeps everything running. Derek thought he was cutting costs. He was cutting his own throat. Richard thought he was protecting his legacy. He was handing it to someone who would destroy it. And I thought I was losing everything. Turns out I was just changing addresses. The lake sparkles in the morning sun, $12 billion in assets under management, a corner office with my name on the door, a partnership stake that's worth more than everything I earned in 19 years at Hartwell combined. My son came to visit last month, stood in my office, looking at the view, shaking his head. "Mom," he said, "I can't believe they let you go. Their loss." Their loss. 2 simple words, but they summed it up perfectly. Sometimes the best revenge isn't anger. It's success. It's watching the sunset from your corner office while the people who tried to destroy you fade into irrelevance. Derek is selling insurance now, commission-based work, the kind of job where you have to hustle just to pay rent. Richard is retired for real this time. Heart trouble, the stress of watching his firm collapse didn't help. And Hartwell Capital Management, it's a footnote in someone else's quarterly report now. Absorbed, forgotten. But I'm still here, still doing the work, still keeping the lights on. That's the thing about being irreplaceable. Eventually, people figure it out. Usually too late. Thanks for sticking around. If you enjoyed watching someone's corporate arrogance implode in slow motion, hit that subscribe button. The algorithm loves company. And if you've got your own story about a boss who learned the hard way not to underestimate the quiet people who keep everything compliant, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. We redundant folks have to stick together.